So my name is Debbie Orrs. I'm with the Community Water Center. As I said, we have been very appreciative of the work that staff has put into this order and their commitment to work with us. We appreciate many of the changes that have been made to this order, and especially in the most recent change was a more clear timeline for development of these groundwater protection targets. These targets, while on their own will not be enough. I mean, as Nat pointed out, they are a really good tool to look at compliance in a larger scale, and to get the data to really look at what loading is looking like at a township level. That said, we do believe that these groundwater protection targets should be applied regardless of region. And if there was any sort of limit on them, it should be any limit on applying the groundwater protection targets should be tied to a limit on anonymity, because that was the basis of our negotiation, was that the anonymous field level data would be allowed in exchange for groundwater protection targets. So if a region should not get anonymity and no groundwater protection targets. You know, as Nat pointed out, you know, on their own, groundwater protection targets will not be sufficient. It really needs to be done with individual compliance, and how effective this order will really depend on the ability and the commitment of regional board staff to work with the coalitions when there's outliers and when there appears to be the fields that are over applying, and also the regional board's commitment to use enforcement tools where there is a grower that continues to be out of compliance and continues to non-prove their management practices despite help and assistance from the coalition. So that's really all this has to be working together. If that's the case, then I think that we will actually start moving in the right direction in protecting groundwater in these practices.
I think the 3-year reviews that we've put in are going to be not necessarily the proof in the pudding, but it's going to be a way to keep the spotlight, because it's clear in listening to the, people can have a sense of what the perfect is on all sides, but the fact is we don't know for sure, which is in a way how we'll see the 2 different models of more transparency, and can the coalitions really make a difference and see how it's going. I think it lights a fire under everyone to make whatever model it is they prefer work to show benefits on the ground, because we'll be reconsidering it based on how clear a story folks can tell about improvement.
Because we want to prevent, that whole tragedy of the commons, prevent hotspots, prevent the disincentivization to underapply.
Hi, Mike Claiborne with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. And I'm going to address one issue that we remain really concerned about with the draft order, and that's the treatment of the state anti-degradation policy. We've made some written comments, so I'll try to keep this pretty brief because we've raised these issues before. The state anti-degradation analysis in the regional board's order has not been changed as a result of the petition. It's still identical in the attachment A, which is the WDR here. But it raises a question, and that's what does the state anti-degradation policy mean in the context of a general order that applies to non-point source discharges? And our response to that is that it means about the same thing as it means in the context of a general order that applies to point source discharges. And I do want to point out that oversimplifies it a little bit, because both the order here and the dairy order that there's a Court of Appeals decision on apply to both point source and non-point source discharges. So I don't want to simplify it too much, but addressing it just as that distinction, we think that the regional board and the state board here should have looked to the Agua decision from back in 2012 that applied to the dairy order. And that, just from a practical sense, has a lot of analysis that was not done here. It sets forth 4 factors that the regional board should look to and conducted a site-specific analysis on. And those factors are they should have considered beneficial uses, the economic and social costs of the discharge, both to the discharger and to the impacted community. And that's, I think, a major point that wasn't done, looking at what this actually costs in terms of to the discharger and then to impacted communities and those reliant on groundwater. And environmental aspects of the discharge is a third factor, and then implementation of feasible alternatives. We think that this analysis, to the extent it relies on kind of data from the PER in 2011 on the irrigated lands program, is not site-specific, and it's not the affirmative showing that is required in the context of anti-DEG to actually look at what these costs look like in the East San Joaquin, what the feasible alternatives are, and compare kind of the cost to the discharger versus the otherwise important costs that are going to be borne by other communities. We've gotten some, and we've had discussions with staff and some of the board members on this, and I think that some of the responses fall in essentially three categories. And the first response to our suggestion that the analysis should be more robust is that good data isn't always available, and we acknowledge that's true. But we think that staff should have looked at all available data and any data that's reasonably gatherable and actually analyzed that, which wasn't done here. There's really two bullet points that were included in the discussion, and those are that agriculture is important for food and for employment in the Central Valley and the state generally. While we acknowledge those two things are true, they should really be borne down to actual numbers. So what kind of food is grown in the East San Joaquin, how much of it, what's the employment numbers for the East San Joaquin, what would be the cost of imposing more stringent requirements and actual individual limits, and then balance those two things. The second response we've gotten is that it's time consuming to do this analysis. We acknowledge that this would take a little bit more time to go a little bit more a little deeper into the data. But we think that's time well spent, and that gets us to kind of the third response, and that's what's the practical effect of actually digging into this data? And to some extent, that's speculative because we don't know how a robust analysis would have changed what the order looks like today. But one thing I'd point out is that it really doesn't set forth individual limits in this order. It has it refers to outliers, which is good, and we should be looking at outliers, but it could have set a limit. Even if it's not a perfect limit, it could have set a limit at nitrate use. And maybe with a robust analysis, that's something staff would have recommended. We just don't know here. So in conclusion, we just think that this is essentially the same situation that the Court of Appeals considered in Agua in 2012, and that analysis should apply here. Thanks. And happy to answer any questions.
And I don't know how much time there's left, but I'll try to be
7
brief.
minutes and 34 seconds.
Really?
Robust.
You're being efficient.
Yeah.
I don't know how to take more than 3, so we'll see how that works. So I just want to acknowledge that this is imperfect and it's really hard and we've lost a lot of sleep doing it, and that we think that the program's going to change over time. So what this order is, it just sets a lot of wheels moving, and in developing water quality targets, we thought that was essential to have an order so that everyone knew what the goal they were reaching for. So that's why we're okay with this order, maybe. I have to talk to Michael about that first.
Partially okay.
Thank you.
That is the nature of life. You know.
So does that mean you're not at 80%?
I can't do percentages in a non-quantitative situation. I just took too much math in school. So just the idea is this is tough. We're going to go back. We think that the information that's being gathered is important information that's going to give us some idea. I mean, Thomas Harder did some maps for us with year 1 of the East San Joaquin order that showed us that everyone was applying too much fertilizer. And so what we want to look at on your every 3-year order is we want to look at a graph that goes like this. And that's what I want to see. So if that doesn't happen, then we go back and look again. And if it does happen, then we go back and say, okay, great. As a general rule, everyone's doing better, and who isn't. So I totally agree with Nat that hotspots were a big issue for us, and trying to understand how to identify those and how to regulate them in the context of this order is something we're going to continue working on. And I'll probably come and whine about something else next time, but I was here to do the friendly wrap-up today. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all for all the time you've put in as well. I know this stuff is hard. We're still trying to figure it out.
I have a question.
Oh, please.
You don't get to go yet. Thank you all. And I meant to thank Perry and Tess, but I was in a lot of those meetings and ate a lot of candy with you guys. And it was,
Candy?
we did. We had
It was
candy.
candy?
Darren provided chocolates. So
Leadership means knowing.
When you're meeting at 5 to 6 o'clock, you have to keep the energy up.
anyway, I saw a lot of give and take, and it was just wonderful to be in the room when that was going on. I have a question regarding the groundwater protection targets. So the language as originally provided, I don't believe went beyond the East San Joaquin. I'm not saying necessarily that it should be, exactly what we were provided. After all, these were recommendations. But could you speak to some of the concerns that have already been raised regarding whether or not that language would be a good fit in all areas? And if you could, sort of hone in on Central Valley, where maybe it would be different and a better fit for groundwater protection targets versus other regions where maybe it's not exactly what was envisioned in those meetings, but may or may not be a good fit.
So we worked on the Central Valley, and we think that this is a good fit for the Central Valley because of how their order is arranged, because we have these high vulnerability areas. This order, the state board's order does not really recognize the high and low vulnerability, and maybe they don't need to, but I think what you need in every part of the state is a target. And so, for instance, there was a target in the Central Coast order that you removed, and I'm sure that Steve Shim is going to talk about that. So the big question is, how do you tell when you won? Like, how do you tell when you've actually achieved your goal? And there's no way of doing that in the other orders. And so a question is, if it's not going to be this, and it doesn't have to be, what is it going to be? What is a target?